Hello everyone, this is Naerina from 40k Theories, and welcome to this new episode of 40k Lore for Newcomers. For this episode, nominated on Patreon by Akatsuki Grimlaw, we will be taking a brief look at the Traitor Primarch Magnus the Red. This video will be a brief overview for certain events that may be explored in greater depth within additional videos within the future. So, without further ado, let's begin.
The minds of gods are not for mortals to know or judge. Accept that Tzeentch is a place for all of us in his grand scheme, and be happy in the part you have to play.
Magnus the Red, also known as the Crimson King and the Red Cyclops, is the Primarch of the 15th Legion of the Legionis Astartes, the Thousand Suns, one of the 9 Space Marine legions that turned traitor during the civil war known as the Horus Heresy. As a Primarch, one of the gene sons of the Emperor himself, Magnus was a veritable demigod, boasting physical and mental capabilities that not only wholly surpassed those of typical baseline humans, but would even make the superhuman abilities of Space Marines, genetically enhanced transhuman super soldiers, look utterly trivial by comparison. Of all the Primarchs, Magnus himself was, without question, the most powerful and skilled psyker within their ranks, capable of effortlessly harnessing the energies of the warp to manifest a multitude of supernatural abilities. The story of Magnus the Red is a tragic one, for the Primarch would inadvertently sow the seeds of his own damnation, a once proud and noble defender of humanity that would fall from grace, in time becoming the mightiest servant of Tzeentch, the chaos god of magic, change, and fate. Now a demon prince, Magnus the Red's newfound power and insight has seen him rise beyond the concerns of mere mortals, spending much of his time pondering the great mysteries of the warp. Despite this, however, the Crimson King remains without question one of the Imperium's greatest threats, an embittered, vengeful monster who has time and again unleashed his wrath against an empire that he had once sworn to protect.
The only good is knowledge, and the only evil is ignorance.
Like his fellow Primarchs, Magnus the Red was created by the Emperor of Mankind during the later years of the Terran Unification Wars to serve as one of his generals and enforcers for the inevitable Great Crusade, a military campaign to unite all of humanity's lost colony worlds under the banner of the Emperor's nascent Imperium of Man. Magnus, however, was intended to serve an additional purpose beyond that of a mere military commander, for the Emperor had designed the Primarch to serve as the locus for what would eventually become known as the Golden Throne. The Golden Throne was an ancient and highly complex piece of technology that served as the centerpiece for the Emperor's Webway project, a venture in which the Emperor sought to make use of the alien subspace network known as the Webway, in order to both accelerate the evolution of humanity and render warp travel, a vital yet dangerous and highly unpredictable method of faster-than-light travel, completely obsolete. However, before such a project could be completed as intended, the beings known as the Chaos Gods created a tear in the fabric of reality within the heart of the Emperor's gene labs, dragging the nascent Primarchs into the depths of warp space before scattering them across the vast expanse of the galaxy. Magnus himself was transported to Prospero, a remote and desolate world with an exceptionally high population of both latent and extant psykers, with his gestation pod coming to land within the heart of the world's capital city of Tizca. The young Primarch was adopted by a man named Amon, a famed and highly respected scholar who would in time come to serve as Magnus's mentor and tutor. However, it soon became apparent that the young Primarch's psychic potential was far greater than that of any other individual in the Prosperine history, and Magnus quickly grew to first equal, then later surpass his teachers in terms of both skill and ability. Before long, the student would himself become the master and began instructing Tizca's other psykers in how to best make use of their talents whilst avoiding the inherent dangers involved. It is said that the young Primarch accomplished this by not simply channeling the energies of the warp, but by peering into its very depths in order to read the ebb and flow of its currents, though whether such claims are true or not remains a subject for debate. In time, Magnus raised an army to purge Prospero of a horrific threat known as Psyknuen, massive warp-like creatures which, for as long as anyone could remember, had both tormented and preyed upon the native Prosperines. The Primarch's forces utterly decimated the world's Psyknuen population, driving them to the very brink of extinction and forcing what few surviving pockets remained to retreat deep into the wastes. Free from the threat that had plagued them for so long, the people of Prospero were now able to rebuild and restore many other cities to their former glory, with Tisca in particular becoming the world's crowning jewel. A few years later, the world of Prospero was rediscovered by the forces of the Great Crusade, and the Emperor of Mankind set foot upon the world's surface to be reunited with his lost son. Some have claimed that the two were already well aware of each other's existence. Rumors abounded of them having communicated psychically with one another for many years prior to this moment. Whatever the case, the two embraced as father and son, and Magnus himself would be reunited with his own gene sons, the Space Marines of the Thousand Suns Legion, warriors who, much like the Primarch himself, were also incredibly potent psychers. The Primarch's reunion with his legion was both a joyous and sorrowful event, for while he was thrilled at the prospect of having sons of his own, the warriors of the legion were racked with a genetic flaw known as the flesh change, which could cause them to spontaneously develop extreme and rapidly fatal mutations. Unable to bear the suffering of his sons, Magnus vowed that he would eliminate the flesh change from his legion's ranks, no matter the cost.
If I am guilty of anything, it is the simple pursuit of knowledge.
At some indeterminate point in time, Magnus the Red would lose one of his eyes, resulting in numerous rumors being spawned regarding as to how and why exactly this happened. Some say that the Primarch gave up his eye in exchange for knowledge, whereas others maintain that it was lost in battle, while others still claim that his eye was a price that Magnus paid to some godly entity of the warp in order to cure his legion of the flesh change. Whatever the case, Magnus would appear to succeed in eliminating the flesh change from the gene seed of the Thousand Suns, allowing the legion the chance to rebuild its numbers and eventually return to the field of battle. In truth, however, the curse had not actually been purged, but had instead been merely suppressed. The flesh change would once again begin manifesting within the legion's ranks during the pacification of Heliosa. Only this time, the effects of the curse would be witnessed by others, most notably Leman Russ, the Primarch of the Space Wolves Legion. This, in conjunction with the psychic abilities of the Thousand Suns legionaries, as well as the widespread accusations of Magnus himself dabbling in malefic sorcery, would lead to the Emperor of Mankind convening what would become known as the Council of Nicaea. While this council was officially convened to invite open debate over the continued and controversial use of psychers within the ranks of the Legiones Astartes, it would come to be known both popularly and within historical records as the Trial of Magnus. Despite the use of psychers in the majority of the Astartes Legioners, many attendees would come to lay their accusations of Magnus and his legion specifically for dabbling in forbidden sorceries, as well as to expressing their distaste in allowing psychers to be inducted into the legions in the first place. The most notable of Magnus's detractors included Mortarion, the Primarch of the Death Guard, and somewhat hypocritically the Space Wolf rune priest Otho Weirdmake, a warrior who was himself an incredibly potent psyker. Magnus himself made an impassioned defense, his arguments bolstered by the support of psychers from several different legions, including the White Scar Stormseer Targetai Yasugei. Despite this, the Emperor ultimately decreed that the librarius of each legion was to be disbanded, and that every psychically sensitive Astartes return to rank and file duties, being forbidden to utilize their powers. Magnus himself was ordered by his father to cease his studies regarding the nature of the warp and its energies, or suffer grave repercussions. Disheartened by this edict, Magnus agreed to abide by it before both he and his legion returned to Prospero in shame. While he may have verbally acceded to following the terms dictated by the edict, Magnus in truth had no intention of doing so, and thus would continue with his experiments in utmost secrecy. Some time after this, Horus, the Primarch of the Sons of Horus and War Master of the Imperium, would be grievously wounded during the Battle of Davin's Moon and fall into a comatose state. Whilst Horus was unconscious, Erebus, the High Chaplain of the Word-Bearers, began conducting a dark ritual with the intent of having Horus instigate a coup against the Emperor at the behest of the Chaos Gods. Magnus, during one of his experiments, beheld vision of this rebellion, the aptly named Horus Heresy, in addition to the roles each of the Space Marine legions would play in this conflict, save for his own. In desperation, the Primarch sent an astral projection of himself into his brother's mind to expose the corrupted chaplain's plan. However, despite Magnus's best attempts, Horus would ultimately be persuaded by the Word-Bearer's arguments and chose to align himself with the ruinous powers, turning his back upon his father and the Imperium. Magnus attempted to warn the Emperor of Horus's impending rebellion, but due to an increase in the warp storm activity, caused in part by the actions of the Word-Bearers, it became impossible to send any form of astropathic communication from Prospero. Undeterred, the Primarch conceived a plan to send an astral projection of himself to Terra, but would find his path blocked by the very walls of the webway itself. Desperate to find a way through, Magnus unwittingly struck a bargain with the Chaos God Tzeentch, who granted the Primarch the power needed to break into the webway and make haste towards Terra. Magnus's action shattered the barrier before him, in doing so allowing a legion of demonic entities to follow him into the webway network, leading to what would become known as the War within the webway. The Primarch's projection did successfully reach Terra and emerged within the heart of the Emperor's dungeons, but the cataclysmic psychic energies unleashed by the arrival of Magnus inadvertently caused irreparable damage to his father's webway project. Worse still, before he could inform his father of Horus's betrayal, the Emperor, enraged that his son had violated the terms expressed by the Edict of Nicaea, banished Magnus's projection from Terra, before ordering for the Space Wolves Legion to travel to Prospero in order to bring the Crimson King back to Terra in chains. Horus, now fallen to chaos, moved to intercept these orders, instructing Leman Russ, unaware of the War Master's betrayal, to kill Magnus and put Prospero itself to the torch. Magnus himself, unaware of the change to Russ's orders, decided that the best course of action would be for him to passively await his punishment, seemingly ignorant of the bloodshed that was to come.
But I will build you a new legion, a mighty host of warriors greater than any now living. Plans are already in motion to bring about their inception. Soon, you will command warriors the likes of which the galaxy has never seen, whose flesh will be flawless, whose fists are steel, and whose hearts are armored and adamantium.
The Space Wolves Legion, along with forces drawn from the ranks of the Legio Custodes, Sisters of Silence, as well as a company of Astartes from the Sons of Horus Legion and Titans from the Legio Mortis, launched an all-out assault upon the world of Prospero. The resulting conflict, which would come to be known within historical records as the Burning of Prospero, proved to be a monstrously bloody and costly affair, resulting in the deaths of not only tens of thousands of Astartes and millions of human auxiliaries and civilians alike, but also incurring loss of countless irreplaceable tomes and fonts of knowledge, as the many libraries and colleges of the 15th Legion were burned to the ground by the invaders. While Magnus was initially hesitant to fight against his brother, he eventually emerged from hiding to face Leman Russ in a duel. Despite being a mighty warrior in his own right, and even managing to destroy one of his brother's two hearts, Magnus was no match for the sheer bestial ferocity of the Wolf King, who at the height of the battle would raise Magnus up and deliver a devastating backbreaker, shattering his spine with a single blow. But before Ross could finish his brother off, a great spell that had been prepared by Magnus and performed by a cabal of Sykes under the command of his first captain and chief librarian Azhek Ahriman teleported the Thousand Sons away to the demon world of Sortiarios within the depths of the warp. The storm of magical energies caused by the spell, combined with the injuries he had sustained at his brother's hands, resulted in Magnus's physical form being shattered, with psychic shards representing a different aspect of his personality, character and power being scattered across space and time. As a result of the losses they had sustained on Prospero and believed to be traitors to the Imperium, the Thousand Sons were forced to seek sanctuary under Horus's banner once the events of the Horus Heresy had begun in earnest. The shards of Magnus himself retained a surprising degree of autonomy and independence from one another and would go on to play key roles at different points during the conflict, including forcing Jagatai Khan, the Primarch of the White Scars Legion, to finally pick a side in the war and acting as the catalyst for Artilus Numion, a warrior of the loyalist Salamander's Legion, to sacrifice himself to resurrect his Primarch, Vulcan. Eventually, the Thousand Sons managed to retrieve most of their Primarch's errant shards, restoring Magnus to a semi-corporeal form. Years later, during the Siege of Terra, Magnus learned that a powerful and still missing shard of his fractured soul was not only upon the throne world itself, but within the depths of the Imperial Palace. Upon discovering an apparent weak point within the psychic defenses of the palace, Magnus, along with a small retinue of Thousand Sons legionaries, made their way through the great observatory disguised as warriors from the Loyalist Blood Angels before coming upon and traversing the hidden path of Leng, slowly making their way towards the Imperial dungeons. However, upon exiting the path and arriving upon the shores of a vast subterranean lake, Magnus encountered none other than Malcador the Sigillite, the Regent of Terra, a man whose own psychic potency was arguably on par with, if not greater, than that of the Primarch himself. The Regent of Terra invited Magnus to join him for a game of regicide. The Primarch, deciding to humor the man who once was viewed as an uncle, agreed, and the two engaged in a prolonged debate. Malcador informed Magnus that the lost shard of his soul was no longer upon Terra, for it had been used to save the life of the Loyalist Thousand Son Reviel Arvida, and in doing so transformed him into the being named Janus, the first Supreme Grand Master of what would eventually become known as the Grey Knights chapter of the Adeptus Astartes. Enraged, Magnus killed the Sigillite before deciding that his next best course of action would be to kill his father, the Emperor. As Magnus and his retinue advanced deeper into the palace and made their way into the Hall of Victories, the Primarch was confronted by an aspect of his father named Revelation. Revelation led Magnus into the Sanctum Imperialis to the very base of the Golden Throne, before being destroyed by the Primarch. Magnus advanced upon the long stairway, intent on killing his father, though as he did, his followers were ambushed by a small handful of loyalists from the Space Wolf and Salamander legions. Undeterred, Magnus prepared to kill his father, only to be stopped by his brother Vulcan. The Emperor then spoke to Magnus, offering him a chance to redeem himself and return to his side, even promising to grant him an entirely new, more powerful legion of warriors at his command. When Magnus asked about his gene sons, the Emperor lamented that, due to the incurable nature of the flesh change, they were beyond redemption. Such a price was more than what Magnus was willing to pay, and in his anger he attempted to strike the Emperor down, only to be once again stopped by Vulcan. The two would engage in a short but bloody brawl, and Magnus would almost succeed in striking the Lord of Drakes down. But thanks to the actions of the salamander Barak Zytos, who took a fatal blow meant for his Primarch, Vulcan survived. Driven into a paternal rage, Vulcan unleashed his full fury against his brother, and Magnus was beaten almost to death. Left with no choice, Magnus would choose this moment to fully devote himself to Tzeentch, achieving apotheosis and transforming into an entity known as a demon prince, before being temporarily banished from the material realm. Magnus would eventually make his way once again into the bowels of the webway, where he would use his powers to steadily whittle away at the various wards protecting the inner sanctums of the palace from demonic invasion. However, once again he would be stopped by Vulcan. Magnus would then attempt to reason with his loyalist brother to try and make him see his point of view, though this would ultimately end in failure. Vulcan assailed his brother with revelations of his own. The conversation at the foot of the Emperor's throne had been little other than Magnus's own delusion. There had been no promised new legion, no offers of clemency. These had merely been Magnus's own desires made manifest, warped and twisted to ensnare him into the demonic path he now was doomed to walk. Enraged by Vulcan's words, Magnus flew at his brother. The webway duel was orders of magnitude more devastating than any before it, but Vulcan would eventually triumph over his brother, shattering his skull with his thunderhammer and banishing Magnus seemingly for good.
You took no pleasure in what you did. I knew that then, and I know it now. But all things change, my brother. I'm not the same as I was, and you're... Well, let us not mention where you are now.
Following the culmination of the Horus Heresy, which ended in a loyalist victory, the traitor legions would be forced to flee into the depths of the warp space rift known as the Eye of Terror, in order to escape retribution. Magnus, who along with his legion had retreated back to Sortiarius, would slowly begin distancing himself from the affairs of mortals, choosing instead studying the energies of the warp from atop a colossal, physics-defying tower. During the Primarch's isolation, the flesh change would begin to grow more and more widespread throughout the ranks of the Thousand Sons, forcing a cabal of sorcerers, led by Azhek Ahriman, to cast a great spell known as the Rubrek in a desperate attempt to prevent the entire legion from a fate worse than death. The resulting storm of energies grew so intense that even demons were forced to flee from its path, and after a period of several days, Magnus himself was finally forced to intervene and put an end to the Rubrek's cause. The effects of the spell were both a resounding success and monumental failure. While some other legions' more powerful psykers would themselves be seemingly cured of the flesh change, the majority of the legion's warriors would have their bodies reduced to dust, their souls trapped within their now magically sealed armor, reduced to little more than mindless automatons in thrall to the surviving magisters. Magnus, furious at this turn of events, summoned Ahriman and his cabal before him and prepared to execute them. But before the Primarch could strike his first captain down, Tzeentch himself whispered into Magnus's mind to have him stand down, informing him that Ahriman himself was one of the many pawns being utilized in the grand schemes of the Chaos Gods. This would then prompt Magnus to instead banish Ahriman and his followers from Sortiarius, forcing them to embark upon the eternal quest to understand the nature of their patron god. The fact that Ahriman's actions had been unconsciously guided by Tzeentch was of no comfort, for Magnus was still angered by what his first captain had done and vowed to unleash his rage upon an unsuspecting galaxy. The first targets of his wrath were the Space Wolves, and Magnus swore that they too would learn the pain of having their homeworld put to the torch. The Primarch, after successfully luring the bulk of the chapter away from Fenris, the chapter's homeworld, led the Thousand Sons in an invasion of the world, resulting in the conflict known as the Battle of the Fang. However, thanks to the stubbornness of the defenders, led by the dreadnought Bjorn the Fell-Handed, The Space Wolves were able to hold out against their foes, granting the rest of the chapter the time needed to return to Fenris and successfully drive Magnus's forces away. While the Space Wolves would prove the victor in this conflict, it would only come at a great cost, as Magnus would succeed in destroying a cure for the curse of the Wolfen, a major flaw within the very gene seed of the Space Wolves. Several millennia later, following Ahriman's attempts to cast a second rubric spell to undo the damage caused by the first, Magnus, thanks to the actions of a sorcerer named Neku, would succeed in assimilating even more of his lost soul shards into his being, though at the cost of those fragments which represented his more noble nature being forever lost. As the 41st millennium came to close, Magnus would once again launch an invasion of Fenris, but his forces would once again be repelled thanks to the combined actions of the Space Wolves, Grey Knights, and a smaller coalition of chapters led by the Dark Angels. Despite this, Magnus, thanks to the destruction of Midgardia, a world located within the Fenris system, would succeed in pulling Sortiarios from the very depths of warp space and into the material realm. Soon after this, Magnus would learn that his loyalist brother Roberta Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, had returned and was now leading a massive crusade that was making a beeline for Terra itself. Magnus would manage to trap Guilliman's fleet within the depths of the warp space rift known as the Maelstrom, albeit only temporarily. Having foreseen his brother's escape, Magnus ordered his forces to follow Guilliman into the webway, intent on emerging upon the surface of Terra and wreaking utter havoc upon the Imperium's capital world. Guilliman, however, suspecting that his forces were being pursued, would have them emerge not upon Terra, but on Luna, Terra's moon. Magnus and Guilliman would then face off in battle, and the Crimson King would overwhelm his brother both physically and psychically. But before Magnus could land the killing blow, a strike force of custodians and Sisters of Silence would arrive from Terra to intervene. Thanks to their nature as blanks, beings that produce a negative war presence, the Sisters of Silence would manage to weaken Magnus just enough, allowing Guilliman a chance to run his sword through the Demon Primarch's chest, forcing him to finally withdraw. Following the creation of the gargantuan warp space rift known as the Cicatrix Maledictum, which effectively split the galaxy in two, Magnus would turn his attention towards the Emperor's own, earlier plans to accelerate the psychic evolution of humanity. To do this, the Primarch would begin orchestrating a ritual that surrounded Sortiarios that not only subconsciously attracted psychically sensitive individuals to the world itself, but would also increase the rate in which such mutations occurred, an event that would become known as the Psychic Awakening. However, Magnus's efforts would once again be thwarted, this time by a combined force from the Dark Angel and Grey Knights chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. Regardless, Magnus, much like his patron god Tzeentch, continues with his various plots and schemes, and it is only a matter of time before the Crimson King unleashes his wrath upon the Imperium once more. And that concludes this episode of 40k Lore for Newcomers. If you like this video, consider supporting us on Patreon for more content. To those who are new to 40k, we hope you learned something. So, leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.